Hello, welcome to Free Bible Commentary with Pastor Teacher Dr. Bob Utley. Be sure to visit Free Bible Commentary at www.freebiblecommentary.org. Now, here's Bob.
We're going to begin in a new section. It's going to be in the latter parts of Isaiah. And I think it's going to be a marvelous passage for us to look at. I want to take just a minute in this opening section of Isaiah to show you some commentaries. You saw them in the opening, and some other books that are going to be helpful to you. And to kind of set the stage in your mind what we're going to do. There's been much discussion in recent years about Isaiah, because the book seems to fall into two halves. The first half deals with the Assyrian invasion, where the northern 10 tribes are taken captive, but Jerusalem is miraculously spared. The second half deals with the return of the exile after the Babylonian captivity of Jerusalem that occurred in 586. The fall of the northern 10 tribes was 722 BC. Much later, the fall of the southern 2 was 586 BC. Now, some who are very nervous about predictive prophecy or believe that someone else in the school of Isaiah wrote chapters 40 through 66 try to make it another author. I guess one of the books that's been very helpful to me is this little book called The Unity of Isaiah, A Study in Prophecy by Oswald T. Allis. He is from the old conservative Princeton seminary. I really like this man. I think he's done an excellent job, The Unity of Isaiah, and I hope you'll read him for a scholarly defense of 1 Isaiah. Now, I believe in 1 Isaiah, not 2 or 3. And I think we have predictive prophecy here. Now, I realize it's specific, but I just think that the words are used throughout, and I believe in a supernatural God who empowered His prophets to speak supernaturally. Now, the second thing I want to say, in introduction. It seems to me that Isaiah 40 through 66 is much more involved than simply the return of the Jews from captivity in Babylon. Now, I think as I study the Old Testament, I find out a couple of things that really help me to understand it in light of the New Testament. One of them is, it is a common practice in the Old Testament to take an historical occurrence and to use the problems that are happening right now as a foreshadowing of what's going to one day ultimately happen in the time of the Messiah. So I think the return of the Jews from Babylon is used to somehow foreshadow or in a typological significance to the church and to the fullness of Jesus Christ. Now, I do not want to take away from the historical setting of Isaiah. I just want to say that the historical setting doesn't completely fill up the prophecy, though we must start with the historical setting. Now, the last section of what's known as the servant songs, beginning in chapter 40 through 66, that's the larger literary context. But the smaller literary context is chapters 56 through 66, wherein the glories of the future and the restoration and blessing of God is explicated for the people of Jerusalem, used as a type of all of God's people. Now, that is what we're going to be into today. Now, before I get into a verse-by-verse exegesis of chapter 62, I want to show you these commentaries that have been so helpful to me. Now, this is the exposition of Isaiah. This is volumes 1 and 2 by Loophole. Now, this man, I think, has done one of the best jobs in interpreting the Bible of any author I know. And if you're gonna find one book to buy on Isaiah, buy this book. Expositions of Isaiah, Volume 1 does chapters 1 through 39, and Volume 2 finishes the book of Isaiah out. I want to recommend Loophole. I have never disagreed with this man except in the book of Zechariah. And the only reason I disagree with him there, I thought he read too much the New Testament to Zechariah. I think this guy is super. If I was you, if you're buying for a church library or if you're buying for personal use, I would buy every commentary this man does, and I think you'll never be disappointed in Loophole. Now, another one that's a little more technical, matter of fact, it's just plumb technical, but it's really a good one, is the Prophecies of Isaiah by J.A. Alexander. It's put out by Zondervan Publishing Company. Now, this is much more technical. And if you're looking for a real verse-by-verse exposition of this, then this is the commentary you want to buy. You probably have to order it. I've never seen it in a bookstore unless you order it. Now, Alexander has another volume out on the Psalms that I think is just excellent. And I think you'll always enjoy him, though he is a little more technical than Loophole. And these are the two commentaries I'd recommend above all others. Loophole first, Alexander second. And on the unity of Isaiah, Oswald T. Allis. Now, let's go to chapter 62. For Zion's sake, I will not keep silent. And for Jerusalem's sake, I will not keep quiet. Now, what we have here, first of all, is who is doing the speaking? Well, next week, I don't know why they flip-flopped it, but next week we're going to be doing Isaiah 61. And I'm going to go into the discussion of who is speaking there. Simply to say, whoever is speaking in chapter 61 is also speaking in chapter 62. I believe it's the Messiah. Now, you can have your own interpretation, and so we'll look next week more closely at the speaker. But notice the word Zion and the word Jerusalem are in a parallel relationship in Hebrew. Now, this really helps us interpret, because what we have here are two phrases that the author assumes to be synonymous, used in parallel synonymous passages. Zion is, of course, one of the hills in Jerusalem. In modern Jerusalem, it's the hill on which King David's tomb is. But the temple is not on Mount Zion. The temple is on Mount Moriah, where Abraham offered Isaac. But Mount Zion becomes a name for all of the city of Jerusalem. Now, then it says, for Jerusalem's sake, I will not be quiet. Now, Jerusalem is used in the sense of the epitome of the abode of all of God's people. So Jerusalem is used in the sense of the collective people of God. Now, the last part of verse 1 says, and her righteousness goes forth like brightness, and her salvation like a torch that is burning. Now, it is another parallel relationship. The word righteousness is synonymous with the word salvation. Now, in the Old Testament, we must remember that the word salvation has the primary orientation or connotation of physical deliverance before it has the New Testament understanding of spiritual forgiveness. Now, this, God's righteousness and salvation are speaking about the relationship between God's people living a certain way and physical deliverance. For the covenant is all the way through here. And there was on God's behalf, it was salvation. On man's behalf, it was to live in the family characteristics of God. Now, this idea of lightness or brightness, I think may be the Old Testament background to Matthew 5:13 through 16, that we are the light of the world. Always in the Bible, light is a metaphor of health, a metaphor of spiritual truth, a metaphor of God. And so we are lightness as we're related to Him. And His light, brightness and lightness opens up the path that we should walk in and that we should live. Notice it says, and the nations will see your righteousness, and all the kings your glory. Now, this basically, we're going to get into this a little bit later down in verse, let me find it. Yeah, verse 11, where it says, behold, the Lord has proclaimed to the ends of the earth. I really believe that God chose Israel to choose the world. And therefore Israel was to be a kingdom of priests to bring all the world to God. So the way that God deals with Israel, both in blessing and in judgment, is a sign to all the world. See verse 2, verse 11, and chapter 61, verse 9. All right? Now, if we go back up here and pick this up, it says, and you will be called by a new name. Now, I have a graphic that I want to show you all the names in this chapter that God's people are called. So we'll punch that up right now, and you can see all those. And I've left one off because I just plumb right out of room. That number 7, sought out, is 1, and a city not forsaken is the 8th. Now, what we have here are titles for God's people. And every one of them relates to something special that's happened to them. From their old condition as being in exile to their new condition on being released and brought back to the promised land. Now, we're going to get into that in verse 4 and verse 12. Now, when it says a new name, it shows that something radically different and new has happened to the people of God. The new name represents new character, new relationship, which the mouth of God the Lord will designate. God will tell what they're going to be. You also will be a crown of beauty in the hand of the Lord and a royal diadem in the hand of your God. Now, obviously, the word crown of beauty and royal diadem and the word Lord and God are in a parallel relationship. Now, this idea of the people of God as being a crown is something rather unusual. It's in God's hand. He's looking at it. He's got a hold of it. And then it comes to verse 4 to all these different names for God. It will no longer be that you are forsaken, nor will your land any longer be said to be desolate. Now I want to stop here and re-emphasize to you the trauma that happened to these people. God promised them a land. God promised them a temple. They are going to lose the land, they are going to lose the temple, and they're going to be taken captive by a godless group of people. Now the Jews could not understand that. They thought, has God forsaken us? Has God left us? Has God forgotten the covenant? Has He rescinded the covenant? Now the truth of the matter is, we learn from Jeremiah particularly, that God had forgiven His people over and over and over, but they had gotten to such a state of religiosity apart from real faith. You all see Jeremiah chapter 7. That the only way God knew how to bring them back to Himself was to break the covenant on His part too. They'd broken it time after time, but finally He said, I'm going to break the covenant. I'm going to stop my side of the agreement. As a matter of fact, there's even one part where it says God's Spirit left the temple and moved east with the exiles. So the temple is gone, the land is gone, all the promises that were supposed to be permanent and perpetual, they had all been broken. And the people were saying, does God care? Is there any hope? Are we still the people of God? Is there still a covenant relationship? In Jeremiah, the new covenant's mentioned in chapter 31, verses 31-34. The idea about forsaken and desolate is the way they felt when they thought that they had been acted unfairly against by God. Now, God's going to change that to my delight is in her. And the fourth one here, married, is really the word Beulah. And maybe you sung that old hymn, Beulah Land. And it's the idea of married. Now the metaphor here, as usual, we have to take human phrases, human analogies, and apply them to God. So what we do is we know these aren't really accurate, but they're the only human terms we have to describe an infinite, loving Creator God. So we use interpersonal relationships. We call God Father. We call God Husband. We call God near kinsman redeemer. And here is the aspect of God as husband. Now, my delight is in her. Israel is the bride. The husband is God. Now, at the New Testament, that very same analogy is used of Jesus and the church. That's why in Ephesians chapter 5, Jesus is made analogous to the husband, and the church is called the bride of Christ. Okay? Now, for the Lord delights in you, and to Him your land will be married. Now, you just can't imagine how important the land is to a Jew. I get sometimes so amused at modern commentators who say, well, Israel ought to give back that little part of land. It don't make any difference. Friends, for the Jews to give back a little part of land they believe was given them by God as a promise is such a traumatic thing to the point of not even being a possibility. That land is so important to them. It's their inheritance from God, and they believe that to the depths of their souls. Now, then it says, as the young man marries a virgin, and so your sons will marry you. And as the bridegroom rejoices over the bride, so God had rejoiced over you. Now, this metaphor, extended metaphor of God as marriage partner, shows the intimate relationship. In the Bible where it says to know God, that is the word used for sexual intercourse in Genesis 4:1, where it says Adam knew Eve and she conceived. So the most intimate things we have, parent-child, wife-husband, relative, family, those are the metaphors used to describe God's relationship to His people. Now in verse 6. On your walls, O Jerusalem, I have appointed watchmen. Now these watchmen really seem to be God's prophets. The rabbis interpret this to refer to angels, angelic watchers. They probably get it from Zechariah chapter 1, verses 12 through 17, and you ought to look that up. All day, all night, they will never keep silent. You who remind the Lord, take no rest for yourselves, and give him no rest until he establishes and makes Jerusalem a praise in the earth. Now, why would God want prophets or anyone, angels, to keep having to remind him about his promises to Israel? Well, let's think through this. Is this saying that God is forgetful? Is that what we're trying to say? That he has to be reminded of his promises because he's reluctant to fulfill them? Oh, I think not. What we have here is a point of theology that is much more emphasized in the New Testament, and that is this. God has chosen to limit his actions in the world to some extent to the intercessory prayers of his people. Israel was a kingdom of priests. They were to hold the rest of the world and their own nation before the Lord. God is going to limit his actions to some extent to the prayers of his people. That's why I think the verse that says we have not because we ask not is so spiritually relevant to today. Friends, I believe that the world can't imagine what can be accomplished through the intercessory prayers of the people of God. I just wonder if you are a committed intercessor. Do you really take time to pray for other people? Most of my life, people have said, well, prayer changes you more than it changes God. Now, I certainly believe that prayer changes me. But when I pray for a situation that I'm not involved in, and I pray for things around the world that I'll never be a part of, I'm praying for God to do something in history apart from any change that occurs in me. I really do believe that our prayers affect God's plans and performance in our world. That is a heavy statement. I hope you'll check me up on that, see if you buy that. Verse 8, the Lord has sworn by his right hand and by his strong arm. Now this is an anthropomorphic phrase. We're speaking about God as if he had a body. But we know that God does not have a body because God is spirit. So why are we using man's arm as an example of God to swear by? If I could paraphrase this, God is swearing by his own integrity to act in history. God is a God who acts. And we know he is the true God of the universe because he makes a difference in history. He does something in history. Now, friends, God did not just act in history past. God is actively involved in your life today. I think that's so important we see that. Now, it continues then when it says, I will never again give your grain as food for your enemies, nor will foreigners drink your new wine for which you have labored. Now this is a reference to invasion. Now back in Deuteronomy 28 verses 30 through 33, God told them, this is the account of the blessings and cursings on Mount Gezerim and Mount Ebal. The Levite singers were split up, and one sung the blessings and one sung the curses, and it all depended on if we were going to respond to God's will for our life and keep his commandments. And one of the results of breaking his commandments was that someone else would reap the benefit of our agricultural produce. Now, in this context, it's showing that God has reinstituted the covenant, and he will not let those things happen. Now, in verse 9, but those who garner it will eat it and praise the Lord, and those who gather it will drink it in the courts of my sanctuary. Now we're talking about a fellowship meal here in the temple, the rebuilt temple, obviously. Now I think you ought to go back to Deuteronomy 12:18 for a possible allusion to this same act. Now this is my understanding of the Lord's Supper. The background of the Lord's Supper, I believe, is not primarily the Passover service, but the communion meal of the Old Testament, where an offerer brought a peace offering to God. And the priest took the animal and he sacrificed it. And he took the blood and put it on the altar and the entrails with their fat. And then he took part of that animal for his lot. And then he gave the rest of that meat back to the man to have a fellowship meal with himself, his family, his friends, and God. It was a communion meal where God ate with them. I think that passage in Revelation 3:20 that talks about a church coming back to fellowship with God and having a supper with God is the same kind of fellowship meal that's described right here of a man, his family, his friends, and his God. Now in verse 10, Go through the streets, the gates. These are both imperatives. Now when it says go through the gates, what's it talking about? Well, is it talking about a rebuilt Jerusalem or the ruined gates of Jerusalem? Is it talking about those who are leaving Persian cities and going to Jerusalem? Or is it talking about those who are left in the land and are going out from ruined Jerusalem to prepare the way for the exiles? Well, it's not sure which way it's going. But notice that where it says clear the way for the people and build up the highway, remove the stones, lift up the standard over the people. Now this metaphor of rebuilding the highway and this metaphor of removing the stones out of the road is used in two ways in the Bible. And I think they're somewhat related. It's used of preparation for the royal visit of a king or major dignitary. It's also used here as a preparation for return from the exile. Now this allusion to build up the highway is used in Isaiah 35, 8 through 10, and it's called the highway of holiness. It's also used in Isaiah 40, 3 through 4, and this is where John the Baptist took his watchword from, a voice crying in the wilderness, make way, the road of the Lord. Now I think it's a preparation for the return of exile. Now let me say what I really think it's doing. It's using the analogy of physical preparation of a road for the spiritual preparation that's needed for the Jews to return home. It's using physical road repairing and the dressing up of a city for a royal visit to the people getting ready to return to God in a spiritual sense. Now, let me continue then. Behold, the Lord has proclaimed to the end of the earth. Now, why would God want to tell all the earth that Israel's going home? Because Israel is a unique sign of both the love and the justice of God. When Israel sins, she gets it. When Israel is faithful, she is blessed. All the world sees something of God through the promises He's made to Israel, and I believe that's still valid today. Now, then it says, say to the daughter of Zion, lo, your salvation comes. Now, remember, salvation here is primarily physical deliverance. Although it has an element of spiritual deliverance, the primary focus in the Old Testament is physical, and the primary focus in the New Testament is spiritual. The same thing is true of election. In the Old Testament, the primary focus of election is service. In the New Testament, the primary focus of election is spiritual salvation. Now, behold, his reward is with him, and his recompense goes before him. Now, you ought to see chapter 40, verse 10 for this same idea. Now, the fact that God's recompense and reward goes before him is the idea that God always comes to man first with grace, I think. Now, man needs to respond, but God always comes in grace. Now, God is going to bring them back from the exile because He promised, and because there has been a change in the spiritual awareness of the people of God. Okay? Now, verse 12. And they will call them the holy people. Now, you ought to read Exodus 19, 5 and 6, where Israel is called a holy people, a peculiar nation, a special treasure. Now, this is a sense that they are to be a kingdom of priests to bring all the world to God. Now, this is used of the church in 1 Peter 2, 5 and 9 and Revelation 1, 6. I believe the promises to Israel are spiritually analogous to the church because I believe the church is the spiritual inheritor of all the Old Testament promises, that they are spiritual Israel, that they are the people of God. If you don't believe that, and if you're dispensational and you sure don't, look at Galatians 3:29. Look at Romans 2:28 and 29. Look at Ephesians 2 and 3 without the bias of your dispensational teaching, and see if you can admit there's some truth to that. Now, the redeemed of the Lord. Now, here is another metaphor of an inner personal relationship used to describe God. The word redeemed means goel. purchased back. It's the near kinsman who buys back the relative from slavery or poverty. In Ruth, it's what Boaz is. The near kinsman, the Goel. That's what the word redeemed means. Very significant interpersonal title for God. And here for His people, the redeemed of the Lord. And it's the word Yahweh. Notice the word Lord's in all caps. Exodus 3:14, I am that I am, the Hebrew verb to be. And you will be called sought out. Now they had felt forsaken. They had felt run out of the land. And now they were sought out. God is pursuing them. That's a beautiful metaphor for God. The hound of heaven, one English poet called Him. God's always on your trail, my friend. He wants you to know Him. He's always after you. That's the idea of the sought out ones. And then finally, a city that is not forsaken. You see, the Jews really thought that God had forsaken them when the temple was destroyed and Jerusalem fell. God promised that city would never fall, and here it had fallen. So what we have here is Him saying, yes, it's true, I took you in judgment out of the city, but it shall be rebuilt if you trust me. The spiritual aspect of the covenant will be re-renewed and multiplied. And I think the new covenant is really fulfilled in the life and ministry of Jesus Christ. For in these servant songs, there is no way we can miss passages like Isaiah 53. And I think Isaiah 61 as a direct reference to Jesus of Nazareth, God's fully anointed Messiah, the promised one. So we must see the historical situation here of the return from the exile. Though it's much later than the historical Isaiah's day, I think he saw it, prophesied, and recorded it. So it's not Isaiah's day, it's the future for Isaiah. But for us, it's the past. And I think it accurately speaks historically to the restoration from Babylonian captivity. But I think ultimately it foreshadows what's happened in Jesus Christ and the full covenant of the New Testament that's made manifest in our lives today. I've really enjoyed being with you. Please read Isaiah 61 for next week, and I'll see you then. God bless you.